In the spring of 1893, a financial terror swept through America with such ferocity that grown men wept openly in the streets of New York, while farmers in Kansas loaded their rifles, convinced that the end of their world had arrived. Banks collapsed like dominoes, railroads went bankrupt by the dozens, and unemployment surged past 20% as the nation plunged into what would become known as the Panic of 1893. Yet hidden within this catastrophe was a revolution that would reshape American democracy and forge the economic foundation for what we now recognize as the middle class. The weapon of this revolution was not steel or gunpowder, but something far more subversive: silver. To understand how a metal could ignite such transformation, we must first grasp the stranglehold that gold had placed upon the American economy. Since the Coinage Act of 1873, which critics would bitterly call the crime of 1873, the United States had effectively abandoned silver as a monetary standard and embraced gold exclusively. This wasn't simply a technical adjustment in monetary policy. It was a profound shift in who controlled America's financial destiny. Gold was scarce, concentrated in the hands of Eastern bankers and European creditors. When money is based solely on gold, those who possess gold possess enormous power over everyone else. They could contract the money supply at will, making every dollar harder to obtain and every debt more crushing to repay. The farmers of America's heartland understood this dynamic with brutal clarity because they lived it every single day. A wheat farmer in Nebraska who borrowed $1,000 in 1873 to buy land and equipment found himself in 1893 still owing that same $1,000, but the purchasing power of each dollar had increased dramatically. Where he might have repaid his debt with 1,000 bushels of wheat in 1873, by 1893 he needed perhaps 1,500 bushels to settle the same nominal debt. The gold standard had created a silent thief that crept through the fields at night, stealing labor and crops and transferring wealth steadily from the productive class to the creditor class. Deflation, the steady increase in the value of money, was destroying the American farmer even as his harvests grew larger and his work grew harder. This was not accidental. The Eastern financial establishment, centered in New York and intimately connected to London's banking houses, benefited immensely from a tight money supply. J.P. Morgan and his contemporaries could lend scarce gold-backed dollars at high interest rates, secure in the knowledge that deflation would make every loan more profitable over time. Railroads and industrial concerns relied on Eastern capital, which gave bankers extraordinary leverage over the entire economy. The system was elegant in its cruelty. Those who owned capital saw it appreciate automatically, while those who produced actual goods saw their labor devalued continuously. Into this cauldron of resentment stepped an unlikely coalition of silver miners, indebted farmers, and political radicals who understood that the fight over silver was really a fight over democracy itself. The silver miners of Nevada, Colorado, and Montana had their own mercenary interests, certainly. The demonetization of silver had destroyed the value of their product overnight. But their cause resonated far beyond the mining camps because it spoke to a deeper truth about monetary sovereignty. If the people could force the government to coin silver freely at a ratio of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold, the money supply would expand dramatically. Debts would become easier to pay. Farmers could breathe. Workers might find employment. The stranglehold of the creditor class would be broken. The political establishment recoiled in horror at such proposals. Grover Cleveland, a Democrat who might as well have been a Republican for all his devotion to gold orthodoxy, viewed free silver as tantamount to theft. He believed, with the certainty of a man who had never missed a meal due to deflation, that sound money required gold backing. To inflate the currency with silver would be to violate sacred contracts and destroy America as credit in international markets. His allies in the press published endless columns, warning of the chaos that would follow any departure from the gold standard. They invoked the specter of continental currency from the Revolutionary War, which had inflated into worthlessness, conveniently ignoring that the problem then was not the absence of gold backing, but rather the absence of any capacity to tax, and the presence of British counterfeiting operations. What the gold advocates could not acknowledge, or perhaps could not comprehend, was that their sound money was unsound for the majority of Americans. A currency that steadily appreciates in value is wonderful for those who already possess it, but catastrophic for those who must earn it through labor or acquire it through sale of commodities. The gold standard created a paradise for rentiers and a purgatory for producers. Every farmer who planted in spring and harvested in fall was engaged in a speculation on deflation, and deflation was winning every single time. The Panic of 1893 revealed just how brittle this golden edifice truly was. When credit contracted and banks failed, the economy seized up like an engine without oil. Unemployment in some cities reached 40%. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Jacob Coxey led an army of unemployed workers from Ohio to Washington to demand that the government create jobs through infrastructure spending, an idea so radical that Coxey was arrested for walking on the grass of the Capitol. The suffering was immense and undeniable, yet Cleveland and his allies insisted that the solution was more of the same medicine that had caused the disease. They demanded adherence to gold, protection of the currency, and patience from the starving. This intransigence proved to be a fatal miscalculation because it validated everything the silver advocates had been saying. Here was proof positive that the gold standard served Eastern bankers while immiserating everyone else. The Democratic Party, long dominated by its conservative Eastern wing, began to fracture as its Western and Southern members defected to the silver cause. When the party gathered for its 1896 convention in Chicago, the fault lines had become chasms. Then, a young congressman from Nebraska named William Jennings Bryan took the stage and delivered what remains perhaps the most consequential speech in American political history. He was only 36 years old, largely unknown outside his home state, and utterly contemptuous of the financial establishment that had brought the nation to its knees. His voice rang through the hall as he defended the farmers and workers against the accusation that they were disturbing business. "You come to us and tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard," he thundered. "We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic, but destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country." The delegates went wild with recognition and relief that finally someone was speaking their truth. Bryan built to his devastating climax, declaring that the Democratic Party would fight for the common people against those who would press down upon the brow of labor a crown of thorns. Then came the image that would echo through American politics for generations. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The convention erupted. Bryan had not merely won the Democratic nomination. He had transformed the terms of American political debate forever. The 1896 election became a referendum on whose interests the government would serve. Bryan barnstormed the country by train, speaking sometimes a dozen times per day to enormous crowds who saw in him their last hope for economic justice. Mark Hanna, the Republican strategist managing William McKinley's campaign, understood the existential threat Bryan posed to the established order. Hanna raised unprecedented sums from terrified bankers and industrialists, essentially inventing the modern political fundraising machine in the process. McKinley, kept at home in Ohio in a carefully choreographed front porch campaign, promised prosperity through high tariffs and sound money, which meant gold. The election hinged on a simple question. Would workers in the industrial cities of the North recognize that their interests aligned with the farmers of the South and West against the financial elite? Or would they be persuaded that free silver threatened their jobs and their savings? Hanna and his allies spent lavishly to convince factory workers that free silver meant inflation, which would destroy the value of their wages and their modest savings. They painted Bryan as a dangerous radical who would bring economic chaos. They promised that McKinley's election would open the shuttered factories and end the Depression. Bryan lost, though the margin was closer than the gold advocates had feared. McKinley carried the industrial states while Bryan swept the agricultural regions, revealing a nation divided not primarily by the old Civil War allegiances, but by economic function and interest. Yet Bryan's defeat was not the end of the silver movement's influence, quite the opposite. The campaign had fundamentally altered American politics by forcing both parties to acknowledge that monetary policy was not a technical matter to be left to bankers, but a profoundly political question about the distribution of wealth and power. Moreover, events soon vindicated the core insight of the silver movement, even as they rendered the specific remedy of silver coinage obsolete. Gold discoveries in Alaska and South Africa dramatically expanded the global gold supply in the late 1890s, producing exactly the monetary inflation that the silver advocates had sought to achieve through bimetallism. Prices began to rise, debts became easier to service, the economy expanded. Farmers found relief not through the political victory they had sought, but through geological happenstance that accomplished the same end. This accident of timing allowed the gold advocates to claim vindication while quietly enjoying the benefits of the very monetary expansion they had opposed. The economy of the early 20th century boomed on an inflating gold supply that did precisely what Bryan had promised free silver would do: transfer wealth from creditors to debtors, and from rentiers to producers. The middle class that emerged in the Progressive Era and flourished in the mid-20th century was built upon this foundation of looser money and easier credit. Though few acknowledged the debt owed to the despised Silverites who had fought for these principles when it was unpopular and dangerous to do so, the intellectual legacy of the silver movement proved even more consequential than its immediate economic impact. The populists and Bryan Democrats had articulated a fundamental challenge to laissez-faire orthodoxy by insisting that government had both the right and the duty to manage the currency in the interests of the majority rather than a creditor minority. This was rank heresy to the classical economists of the era, who believed that money should be neutral and automatic, governed by impersonal market forces rather than political decisions. Yet the silver movement demonstrated that there was nothing natural or inevitable about the gold standard. It was a choice, and choices could be changed. This insight would bear fruit decades later when the Great Depression revealed that the gold standard, far from being the bedrock of financial stability, was actually an instrument of economic catastrophe. As countries clung to gold in the early 1930s, they imported deflation and depression. Those nations that abandoned gold earliest recovered fastest, a pattern so clear that it could not be denied. Franklin Roosevelt, his decision to take America off the gold standard in 1933, was a direct descendant of Bryan's campaign 40 years earlier. Though Roosevelt never acknowledged the connection, the Federal Reserve System itself, created in 1913, represented a compromise between the silver movement, his demand for democratic control of money, and the banking establishment, his insistence on expert management. The Fed was granted power to expand and contract the money supply through mechanisms more sophisticated than silver coinage, but the underlying principle was the same. Money should serve the productive economy rather than constraining it. Every time the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates to stimulate employment or raises them to cool inflation, it is engaged in exactly the kind of active monetary management that the gold advocates of the 1890s insisted was impossible and dangerous. The modern American middle class, which reached its apex in the decades following World War II, rested upon a foundation of economic policies that the Silverites would have recognized and applauded. Progressive taxation, government investment in infrastructure and education, labor rights, and active monetary management to maintain full employment all descended from the populist challenge to laissez-faire orthodoxy. The GI Bill that sent millions to college, the home loans that created suburban prosperity, the steady wage growth that allowed a single factory worker to support a family. These were made possible by policy choices that rejected the sound money orthodoxy of the Gilded Age. Today, as we debate cryptocurrency and central bank digital currencies and modern monetary theory, we are relitigating the same fundamental questions that animated the silver movement. Who controls money? In whose interest is it managed? Should currency be scarce and hard, favoring those who already possess it, or abundant and flexible, serving those who produce goods and provide services? The specific technologies change, but the underlying political economy remains remarkably constant. The silver panic and the movement it spawned teach us that money is never neutral and monetary policy is never merely technical. Every choice about currency represents a decision about who prospers and who struggles, who is empowered and who is subordinated. The farmers and workers who rallied to Bryan's cause understood this instinctively, even if they lacked the vocabulary of modern economics. They knew that the cross of gold was crushing them, and they demanded the right to forge their own monetary future. Though they lost the battle, they won the war by transforming how Americans think about money, government, and economic justice. The middle class they fought to create stands as their monument, even as new battles over money and power rage on.